your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News.
Welcome to a Bridge City News special report. I'm Rod Kurtz. Later in the program, we're going to discuss the controversial issue of medical assistance in dying. But before we get to that, we want to take a few moments and mark today, which is Truth and Reconciliation Day across the country. The purpose of the day is to raise awareness about the damaging effects the residential school system had on Indigenous communities. Chataya Holy Singer is an arts graduate at the University of Lethbridge. Her mother experienced the residential school system firsthand, and those experiences have impacted Chataya's art, and she's here now to tell us about that. Chataya, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So let's go back to how old roughly were you when your mom started to share some of those details of her time in residential school? What are some of your first memories of that?
I was very young, and I was around the age of 10 when the Truth and Reconciliation Calls to Action Commission kind of initially came out, and I remember Stephen Harper had the apology in 2008, and they kind of started coming up with the first initial reports of the residential school impact, and they had came around when I was about 10, 11, and a lady showed up, and she was the one who was documenting all of the evidence, and so
she actually spoke with your mother and interviewed her?
Yeah.
Okay. And your mother was from the Kainai Nation and went to what school?
She went to St. Mary's residential school, which is located on the Kainai Blood Reserve. It's no longer in existence anymore. It had, I think, there was a fire that started back when, over 10 years ago. So, yeah.
So as you grew, as you were getting older, how did you process what she had told you? I know we're not going to go into detail about that, but how did you process it as you became older, as you got into your teen years? What were you thinking about?
It was a combination of just everything. I think that I can't really pinpoint it to a specific person, place, or thing. What I had known growing up is my mom had definitely a lot of intergenerational trauma. And as I got older, I started to understand a lot more of the effects of colonialism, especially going into post-secondary. And so that's kind of where my thought process went with the effects of residential school. And I feel that she definitely had a lot to share in the time that I had spent with her. But it was just unfortunate that it was just the way how things had went, and so.
Yeah, and she passed away when?
When I was 13, so.
So your family, she went through trauma. There was also trauma with other members of your family, and in the middle of this, you start pursuing art. Where did the art passion come from?
I had always been born with it. I never, there wasn't a specific time or place where I wanted to pursue it. It was just born in me. And ever since I was younger, when they ask you what you want to be when you grow up, it was always to be an artist, and that's never changed. And so that's really where my passion for art started to really evolve over the years as a kid, and even growing up and into my teen years, taking art classes and just doodling in my book and stuff. And so for me, my art practice had became an escape. And so that's really where my creative practices started to come into fruition, especially when I got into post-secondary. So,
when did it start to connect to your Blackfoot heritage? When did you start to make a connection to that part of your family's history?
I would say in the first few years of my post-secondary journey, I had a exhibition opening with former Indigenous art studio professor Jackson Two Bears. In the spring of 2019, we did an exhibition called Stories for Our Collection. And that was really the first instance of where I was able to take my creative practice professionally in an art gallery setting and I was able to create a mural, installation art, and really embody the practice of Blackfoot knowledge and tradition into my creative practice. And so I really like to think that I take contemporary mediums with traditional knowledge and combine the two into a interdisciplinary practice.
I'm gonna ask you for one particular detail though, because we did talk about this beforehand. You were really working like almost 24/7 on this mural.
Yeah.
And there was, I believe, a moment where it was just, you were just trying to get it done. But in that moment was kind of that moment of realization of, I don't know if it was cathartic or what, but maybe explain a bit of that moment.
Yeah, so I was working on this mural tirelessly. It was a design based on a work that we had where we were able to look at the collection of the late Margaret Hess, who the art gallery is actually named after, at the U of L. And I saw this print by Jackson Beardy, and it had like a sun symbol. And I recognized that symbol because I had drew that in a lot of my doodles growing up. And so I wanted my art's response to replicate that, kind of in my own way, my own spin on it. And I was creating this mural and painting on the wall, and there was a lot of reflection and a lot of like mindless work when it comes into like the art making process. And so through that process, I really found there was a lot of reflection in my own personal life and in my own personal journey. And through that, I really felt all of these memories and feelings that I hadn't realized that were, repressed, especially from my upbringing and also my mother's. And those memories really brought up a realization for me that art making is part of the healing process. And so it wasn't like I was putting bad into my work. It was like it was manifesting as something that was like my creative visual work was, that's where my energy was being put into. And that's when I realized that it was unlocking all of these, feelings and emotions and all of these things that I didn't realize I was keeping in, and it was being released through the form of art and through like the painting, and just the movements of me creating that mural was really where I started to connect the dots. And that's part of my healing process, and that's probably really where my purpose of art came from. And so that was the moment where I realized that that's that feeling that I want to keep chasing, because it will only put the pieces together for me to heal these parts of me, and also in that way heal parts of my mom and my family.
Yeah.
And so
I want to talk about how that plays into your message to other Indigenous young people. What's your message to them? I know you pursued a post-secondary education, and there are family members who didn't, and you've obviously seen the fruits of that. What's your message to other young people?
I would say that just pursue what you feel that you're passionate about. There's no wrong way to go about achieving your education. For me, education was key because it was the part of my escape, and it was a path forward, and to really tell my story the way how I want to tell it. And there's success in being able to turn all of that pain and any adversities that you grew up with and turn it into something beautiful. And it doesn't just have to be art. It can be anything that you're passionate about, as long as you use that as a medium to help push forward, and definitely bringing Indigenous voices forward, because we need more people that represents our communities in a positive light.
You've kind of focused on, I believe, photography as kind of your main passion. What's next for you? What's the plan ahead?
I do want to get into my Master of Fine Arts, and I am looking more to get into the traditional mediums, so kind of thinking more like working with natural materials and organic materials, and kind of connecting back to the landscape and also just the land itself. and learning more of relearning my language. And I want to combine those things together into my practice and definitely have more of an emphasis on the Nitsitabi knowledge and values into my work. And that's kind of where I'm kind of thinking where my practice will go going forward.
How important has it been to make those connections to your Blackfoot heritage?
Oh, very important. I feel like it reconnected me to my identity and where I come from, and it's really important to highlight those parts of myself and to represent them in the way how I create, and just to have that visual language there, I think is really important, and also just helps me heal those parts of myself and in my family. And I feel like that's, the Indigenous art is definitely a way for us to tell stories, and we've always kind of told stories like that.
It's great to have you with us today, Chataya. I appreciate you coming in and telling us some of your story today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chataya Holy Singer is an arts graduate from the University of Lethbridge, and we thank her for coming in today. Coming up on our special report on medical assistance in dying, up next we speak to Conservative MP Andrew Lawton about where the discussion around the issue currently stands and where it's going. Stay with us. Welcome back to this Bridge City News special report on medical assistance in dying, or as it's commonly called, MAID. Access to MAID has been expanding rapidly in recent years. There's growing concern about a change that's on the horizon. By March of 2027, the plan would be to expand MAID to those whose sole underlying condition is mental illness. Some see this as a necessary thing, while others see it as dangerous. Our Jeanette Rocher had a chance to speak with Andrew Lawton. He's a former journalist and now the new Conservative MP for Elgin, St. Thomas, London South. Here's their conversation.
Andrew, so this is a deeply personal issue for you. Before you share your story with us, can you maybe explain the backstory of how MAID got to this point in Canada?
Yeah, so people may know there have been a couple of key Supreme Court decisions on the legality of assisted suicide, one of which was in the 90s. It's called the Rodriguez case, and in that situation, the Supreme Court said there was no right to medically assisted deaths. And the Supreme Court heard it again within the last decade in what's known as the Carter case. And in that situation, they said that there is a right to MAID. So the Canadian laws responded. They passed a number of rules and regulations surrounding it that were subject to rigorous debate. The issue that we're dealing with now is the expansion of those rules. So there was a bill a couple of years back that went before the House of Commons called C7. This was a bill that responded to a court decision in Quebec called the Truchon decision, which said that some of the restrictions around MAID were too significant, were too severe. In the course of debating that, the Senate passed an additional amendment, which no one had asked for except for some activists in this space, which was that people who have a mental illness alone, no physical ailment whatsoever, should be allowed to access MAID. And there were a number of concerns brought up from mental health advocates, from psychiatrists, from the mental health sector, from healthcare workers in general about this. And the compromise that the Liberal government put in place was, well, we'll just set a date that this will come into effect in the future on, and then we'll figure all that stuff out. And they've had to extend that date twice. We still have not so-called figured it out. And if nothing changes right now, as of March 2027, you will be allowed to seek MAID for only a mental illness. And that's what I'm trying to stop with a campaign that I've launched called the I Got Better campaign, and a private member's bill by my colleague Tamara Jansen in British Columbia called Bill C-218, or the Right to Recover Act.
Right. Okay. So in March of 2027, what you're saying is Parliament will likely make a decision on this issue one way or another?
So if nothing changes, if nothing happens, it will automatically become legal. Because the previous Liberal government passed this with, I guess you could call it a sunrise clause, where on this particular date it goes into effect. And this bill that I'm supporting and that I'm talking to you about today is to stop that. But if we do nothing at all, it will become legal with no checks and balance to make sure that we're not actually harming and taking away the lives of people who need treatment and support rather than MAID to deal with their mental illnesses.
Okay, Andrew, you mentioned there that you and your fellow Conservative MP, Tamara Jansen, have introduced a private member's bill, Bill C-218, also known as the Right to Recover Act. So what is the goal of this bill exactly?
So the bill itself is very simple. It stops the expansion of MAID to people with mental illness. But the underlying theme of it, which is so important, and it's kind of embedded in the name there, is that we need to be giving people with mental illness supports to deal with it, to overcome it. We need to be ensuring that there is a right to recover from these things, and that we're not giving up on people. When you look at the reports that have been done by the federal government on why people seek MAID, oftentimes aggravating or exacerbating the desire to end their life is nothing medical whatsoever. It's external circumstances such as poverty or loneliness. People that, if they had supports in place to help them with those things, they would feel better able to cope with whatever was driving them towards MAID. And this is just with physical ailments. This isn't with mental health ailments. When you're dealing with the mental health aspect, it's a lot more difficult because my background, and the reason I've been outspoken about this, is that I'm a suicide survivor myself. Nearly 15 years ago, I nearly succeeded in taking my own life. I was on life support and in a coma for several weeks after this suicide attempt, which wasn't my first, but it was thankfully my last. And even more thankfully, it wasn't successful. But I had dealt with very serious depression for years, so serious that I did feel I was better off dead than alive, that I felt there was no way possible my life would ever improve. I'm convinced that if MAID had been available to me at that time, I would have availed myself of it. And knowing the lack of checks and balances that we see in some of these processes, I'm fairly confident I'd be able to get it, and I would not be here today. And, we have in the healthcare system right now, if someone goes into a medical practitioner's office and says, I want to end my life, that is seen as a symptom. That is seen as something that we need to stop. And there are actually legal and ethical imperatives that a healthcare worker needs to employ to support someone who says that. So how could the answer to dealing with mental illness ever be help in ending someone's life? And that's what we're trying to stop with this bill.
Well, first of all, Andrew, I'm so sorry that you ever had to go through that. That's absolutely terrible. And thank goodness it was an unsuccessful attempt. I can see why you're so passionate about this issue and why this issue is so important to you. But out of that, you have launched the I Got Better campaign. And I understand that you have a petition to sign and you're asking people to email their stories to you. So maybe explain a little bit about what the I Got Better campaign is.
Yeah, a lot of it was a platform to share my own story and tell people, including telling past me, that life can get better than you ever think it can in the depths of despair and in the darkness. And my goodness, if 15 years ago when I was, staring down this decision to whether to take my life or not, I never would have believed it. If you had said, you're going to be a member of parliament in 15 years, you're going to have this amazing, beautiful, intelligent wife, you're going to have all of this stuff going for you, the media career I've had, all of this stuff that in that darkness I never thought was possible. And because I had tried treatments, I had tried a number of other ways to get better, and nothing worked until it did. And, everyone's mental illness is different. For me, it was depression. You have people that deal with serious anxiety, people that deal with serious eating disorders. And then you have things bipolar, schizophrenia. I mean, there's a spectrum of these things. But we are getting so much better at treating people with these things. And in some cases, you can completely heal and recover. In other cases, you can at least get to a point where you're still able to thrive and flourish in your life. But none of that is possible if we stop that and take away that right to recover, take away that right to improve, which I think every Canadian has. And MAID will stop that. And we need to be giving people the support they need, not ending their lives.
Mm-hmm. For sure. So, Andrew, so I guess your goal is to collect these stories then, right? And then to bring them to Parliament?
Yeah, so here I'll say a couple of things. One is political in nature, which is that this is not and should not be a partisan issue. Obviously, it was the previous Liberal government that passed the expansion, but there were several Liberal MPs who were very outspoken against this. And, we're hopeful that we will see support from all parties on this to some extent to stop this. And this is a life or death issue for people. So the I Got Better campaign is doing two things. One, it's collecting stories, as you mentioned. I want other people to share as much as they're comfortable what they've gone through and how they themselves are able to testify to how they thought that life could never improve, and then it did. And I've had so many people that have reached out. Some are willing to share publicly. Others just wanted to share it privately, which is also fine. Just to say that there was a period in which they would have sought MAID, and now they are so grateful they didn't. And the other side of it is we're going to be encouraging people to contact their members of parliament, whomever it is, whether it's a Liberal, a Conservative, a New Democrat, Bloc Québécois, not exactly any Bloc MPs around you, but this is a national campaign, and ensuring that they support C218. So we want people to share their stories with MPs so that MPs have a human face on this issue when they face the decision on how to vote on C218.
Okay, very interesting. What are the proponents of MAID saying? Why do they believe it's a positive thing for individuals to qualify for MAID based solely on mental illness alone?
Well, to be honest, it's a very small number of people who are advocating for this expansion, and it's quite a large group of not just individuals, but established groups, not political groups, not conservative groups that are concerned about this. And just to include that, Indigenous leadership, various racialized communities, people that are disability rights activists, the Canadian Mental Health Association. I mean, all of them against this. The proponents of it are very deferential, I find, to this idea that there are checks and balances in place that will stop someone who could get better from seeking it. But there's oftentimes this idea that is not supported in the testimony and evidence that has been put before parliamentarians so far and shared publicly about how you would prevent someone like me 15 years ago from getting it. And even I think it was the CMHA said that there is a huge margin of error. They estimated at 50% in a healthcare practitioner being able to distinguish between suicidal ideation as a symptom and a request for MAID. So if mental health care workers are saying that they don't think we can do this, we need to listen to them.
Oh, absolutely. Andrew, what kind of feedback are you hearing from physicians? Are they supportive or against MAID being brought in solely for mental illness?
Very, very supportive. And I will say that, there are people that have joined this campaign who are very supportive of MAID itself, but draw a line at this expansion. So this is a very narrow effort that just deals with the mental health expansion. This is a life or death issue that will affect thousands and thousands of Canadians, and we have the opportunity to stop it in 2027. And again, healthcare workers have said to me exactly what I shared earlier, which is that if they have a patient that comes into their office and says, "Hey, doc, I want help ending my life," well, are they supposed to say, "Well, actually, we need to stop you, we need to get you psychiatric care," or are they supposed to say, "Here's a pamphlet for MAID, we'll book you in"?
Oh, that's absolutely terrifying. Andrew, what do you see as potential slippery slope issues if Canada does in fact expand MAID solely based on mental illness alone? How far do you think this could go?
Well, it's concerning, and one of the challenges that's already being debated, and I think a debate that will likely happen independently of this campaign, is expanding MAID to minors. There are a number of activists that are pushing for that, but then you have to then view these two in at the same time. Minors with mental illness will then become the next frontier, and that is horrendous. If you can imagine, someone's a teenager 15, 16, 17 years old, who has their whole life ahead of them, believing that it's done, and being able to access MAID. So that's going to be one of the big issues. But again, this bill is focused solely on the mental health expansion, because that is we're literally looking at a countdown clock on this, and we need to act now to prevent that from going into effect.
What would it take to get this private members bill, your bill there, to pass? What should concerned viewers be doing?
Well, write your member of parliament and ask them to support C218. We have some information about the bill and my story available at igotbetter.ca. igotbetter.ca. And if you want to get updates, you can sign the petition there. We'll be sharing it to MPs. But if you have a member of parliament, well, yeah, everyone does if you're Canadian, reach out to your member of parliament. And if you have a story to share with them about why this affects you or someone in your family, do share that. I want members of parliament to know that the human face on this issue when this goes to a vote, hopefully this fall.
Okay, right. So it's going to a vote this fall then?
We hope. So the timeline in the House of Commons for private members' bills isn't always as predictable, but we're expecting there will be a first vote of some kind in the fall. And then beyond that, it will go to committee, and there will still be opportunities to debate some of the fine points and bring in expert witnesses that can testify. And I hope to bring in some of the people that have shared their stories with me at that phase to make sure that MPs know exactly what's at stake here.
Okay, incredible. Well, all the best there with your bill. And thanks so much for your time today, Andrew. Appreciate having you on.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
That was Jeanette Roche in conversation with Andrew Lawton, the new Conservative MP for Elgin, St. Thomas, London South in Ontario. Coming up on our Bridge City News special report on MAID, what do people in southern Alberta think about a medically assisted death? We'll talk to University of Lethbridge professor Dr. Julia Brasilato, who researched that question. She'll share her findings when we come back. Welcome back to our Bridge City News special report on medical assistance in dying, or MAID. The discussion around medically assisted death has been a heated one. While some feel it gives a terminally ill individual control over their death and a dignified end to suffering, others say it's opening a door to a slippery slope that could endanger vulnerable populations like those with disabilities or the elderly. And then there are the medical arguments. Some doctors saying a change in the law could force them to go against the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm, and religious concerns that MAID devalues life and goes against the biblical view that death is divinely ordained. That religious viewpoint can be somewhat found in research done by the University of Lethbridge. A few years ago, Dr. Julia Brasilato and her team released a report called MAID in Southern Alberta. For their research, they interviewed 8 nurses, 1 nurse practitioner, 7 physicians, 2 clinical ethicists, 8 family members, and 3 patients. And as you might expect, there were a broad range of experiences and perspectives. Dr. Brasilato is the Associate Dean in the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Lethbridge. She's also an Associate Professor of Public Health and joins us now to discuss her findings. Dr. Brasilato, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
What led you to dive into this particular research of MAID in Southern Alberta?
Yeah, so at the time I held an Alberta Innovates research chair focused on rural health. So I'd been looking at care for older adults in the rural context already. And my background is in philosophy and bioethics as well. So I have an interest in the topics where there are, strong viewpoints on different sides and lots of complexity. That always interests me.
I assume you wanted to have a diverse group of people for the research. How did you go about selecting this group? What was the criteria?
Yeah, so for this particular study, we were interested in people who had experience with MAID in the rural context. So we weren't trying to cover all different opinions in this particular project, wanting to hear about people who were involved on the ground and what that looked like in southern Alberta. So that included people who'd been involved in MAID care as physicians or nurses, as you mentioned, family members of people who had pursued MAID, and patients who were thinking about it for themselves.
I think there might be an assumption, I don't know how true it is, that rural care isn't as good as urban care. Does that come into play in this discussion at all?
I think the assumption does. We heard varying things on that. Some people said they much preferred rural care. They mentioned the fact that in larger cities, they sometimes felt like a number in the healthcare system, that they were receiving care from a stranger, and that wasn't as desirable. Whereas in southern Alberta, we heard that people said, this is a family doctor who's known my family for many years, perhaps delivered my child. And so it's a privilege and a gift to have them there at the end of life as well.
There is this maybe cradle to the grave mentality in rural areas when it comes to care. People would see the same doctor maybe for many, many years. Does that play a part as well?
Yeah, absolutely. We heard that from a lot of the care providers who said that also helped them feel more confident in being a participant in that provision because they really knew the person's story and context and had witnessed their journey, throughout their life. So yeah, it definitely has some benefits.
Let's talk about as you started to dive into this, as you started to talk with these doctors and nurses and people who've experienced MAID, what did you start to hear? What were some of the conflicts that you started to hear? Some of the things that people were grappling with?
Yeah, some of them are classic challenges that we hear about in healthcare in general. There are some limited care supports in place in Southern Alberta in particular. So for instance, palliative care, chronic pain support, things like that that might supplement people's care at end of life. We heard challenges about accessing some of those services. For MAID specifically also, it's not always evident which providers participate, and so people didn't always know who they could reach out to find out about MAID or know if it was safe to ask about it. People didn't want to travel long distances, particularly during our long, harsh winters, to services in other communities, so travel and access is always an issue. We also heard about some of the challenges and benefits of small communities where everyone knows each other. Right? That can be a real asset for reasons like I mentioned, but it can also be difficult if people want to ask questions about MAID or be involved and they don't know how that will be received by members of their community.
I mentioned in the introduction about obviously religious concerns. Southern Alberta is often referred to as the Bible Belt. How does religion factor into this?
Yeah, we didn't hear too much about that from our participants. And in our demographic survey, it showed that these participants, who were all MAID supporters to different degrees, came from a range of different religious and spiritual belief systems. So it didn't sort of neatly divide in terms of people's feelings for or against MAID based on religious grounds. But some people said, like we had one participant who is Catholic who said initially there was some discomfort with the process, but witnessing the suffering of a family member and then being a part of that death, it was something that she prayed for other people in her life to have that kind of, beautiful, peaceful passing. So I think that there are certainly religious-based arguments against it, but we've also heard there's a lot of nuance there as well.
Yeah, I believe there was one nurse who was concerned, or a doctor, not sure who it was, but was just concerned about possible ostracization from their religious community, that they were concerned how, if people found out they were participating in MAID, how that might go over in their communities. But some of that they were worried about it, but it never happened.
Yeah, that's right. We heard from some people that they had been warned when they first got involved, like share this judiciously. It might be something that causes some conflicts in communities. And other people said like that backlash I anticipated never really came to fruition. And there was sort of a agree to disagree sort of respect for individual autonomy and to say, maybe that's not for me or something I'd pursue, but I get that you're in different circumstances and made different choices.
And I thought that was interesting, just how you said that there about just kind of, you just agree to disagree, and maybe that's a bit of a rural thing as well in Southern Alberta.
Mm-hmm. Kind of that respect for individual choice, and to say, you have the information for your situation, and you'll make those decisions.
I also found it interesting. There was a part of the study where people who came from a farm background talked about that and again, I want to be careful how I word this, but they have witnessed death in terms of how they deal with animals. And that has, in a way, maybe prepared them for MAID. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, we heard a couple of people say something similar to that, where they said, if you grow up with farming or ranching, you're going to see animals who are suffering, humanely euthanized. And I use euthanization referring to animals, not to humans. But they said that seemed like a peaceful, normalized, compassionate thing to do, and that just that experience shaped the way they thought about MAID and said, maybe that's a way that we could approach things when people are suffering too.
Did you hear concerns at all from physicians about the Hippocratic Oath of doing no harm? And were some of them struggling with that at all?
Not in these particular interviews. People did say, there's a lot of self-reflection that goes into this work. It's not something that anyone takes on lightly. The responses from people involved were incredibly thoughtful. They saw it as an important way to be of service to their patients. It was something patients were asking for, and that there were many conversations that went into those provisions. And so, yeah, I think people, they're not very flippant about it. It's something you go into with a lot of care and intention, but they know the stakes are high.
You did this study prior to this talk of expanding the criteria or the eligibility criteria for MAID. You've got some more studies on the horizon, though?
Yeah, that's right. So our research team has received Tri-Council funding, so that's from the federal government. And we're looking at MAID, but not just specific to rural now. So we're exploring, you said early in this interview, about that tension between autonomy and vulnerability. So we want to give people the ability to make choices about the end of their lives that are dignified and comfortable, while also recognizing the law has the capacity to make people eligible for MAID who maybe are vulnerable and might pursue it because there aren't other options available to them. And so we want to make sure we're not being too permissive and allowing too many people access when there could be other ways to alleviate their suffering. So it is this tension that the law has acknowledged early on. And so if I can get a little granular for a second, in the preamble to the first MAID law, the government said that this law struck the perfect balance between promoting autonomy and protecting the vulnerable. And in the subsequent amendments to the law, there hasn't been any discussion about where that balance rests now. And so our project is going to be looking at more recent discussions of MAID, so doing a policy analysis, as well as talking to people who've been involved after the expansion and seeing, if and how some of those concerns have played out in the Alberta context.
Yeah, it's certainly not a discussion that's going to go away anytime soon. I appreciate you joining us to talk about it today, Dr. Bracelato. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for including me.
Dr. Julia Bracelato is the Associate Dean in the Faculty of Health Sciences at the University of Lethbridge. Coming up, anesthesiologist Dr. Joel Zivot created waves with a TED Talk called Medical Assistance in Dying. Not as easy as it looks. He'll explain when we come back. Welcome back. We continue our Bridge City News special report on medical assistance in dying, and this next segment could be somewhat disturbing for some viewers. We warn you ahead of time that we're going to discuss the actual process of a medically assisted death. Dr. Joel Zivot is a Canadian anesthesiologist practicing in the United States. His clinical expertise includes care of critically ill patients in the OR and ICU, as well as research on a variety of topics related to anesthesiology and critical care monitoring. And he is an expert on physician participation in lethal injection. Dr. Zivot, thanks for joining us today. And I became aware of your work online, in particular a TED Talk you gave a few years ago called Medical Assistance in Dying, Not as Easy as It Looks. What was the message of that talk? What flag were you waving to get people's attention?
I'm an anesthesiologist, and I do also intensive care medicine. I'm from Canada originally. I've been in the US for a number of years. And of course, I'm always interested in what's happening in Canada. I've practiced in Canada and trained in Canada. And back, I think it was 2017, there was a legal decision that was known as Carter and Canada. And that decision was by the Canadian Supreme Court that decriminalized physician assistance it's called physician assisted suicide, but of course it's a bit of wordsmithing, because if you kill someone, they're not killing themselves. But nevertheless, of course we now know that commonly in Canada as MAID, M-A-I-D, medical assistance in dying. So I was concerned about that such an action would imperil, I thought, medical professionalism in Canada, because what it seemed to be advocating was really, I think, a wholesale ethical change as to what exactly physicians are supposed to be doing. And what I mean is that medicine, of course, is interested in saving your life and not taking it. And suddenly, and certainly, some of my patients die. As in my intensive care capacity, I encounter a lot of patients who die, and that's normal and natural. But the idea that medicine could be transformed into making a claim or a practice modification, that I could actually kill someone and call that treatment. And that, in effect, is what MAID really invites, is now treatment can be killing. And that, of course, to me was an anathema to the ethical practice of medicine. Here in the US, I'm also involved in an unusual area, which is the United States death penalty. And in my death penalty work, the reason why I got involved in the death penalty was because of the use of, I think, science and medicine as a method of punishing people. And the most common method of execution in the US was or is still something called lethal injection. And it takes certain kinds of chemicals, and that in my hands are medicine, and in the state's hands are poison, repurposes them to kill prisoners. So, and I want to be clear that in my discourse here, I'm not a murder apologist, and I'm not even advocating a position per se on the rightness or wrongness of capital punishment. But what I am saying is that it's not the job of the doctor to kill prisoners in the United States, and not the job of the tools of medicine. So my protest, which I have done now for over 10 years, is that if the state wants to execute people, it has to do something, use a technique that it isn't an impersonation of medicine. Now, as it turns out, assistance in dying in Canada is strikingly similar to the way that prisoners are executed in the United States. And so when I realized that was going on, that really caught my attention. I have done some work in the U.S. death penalty where I've reviewed hundreds of autopsies of prisoners executed using lethal injection, and found a strikingly common finding of bloody froth in their lungs. So when they die, they're actually drowning in their own blood. And now, again, you may have no sympathy for convicted murderers, fair enough, but the U.S. Constitution makes it very clear that when a prisoner or anyone is punished, that punishment can't be cruel. So I advance an argument that I think that the punishment of lethal injection creates a cruel death. And I brought those same concerns to Canada. My concern in the Canadian assisted dying system is that I think that there's, first of all, or there's been a persistent dishonesty in exactly what is happening when people are actually being killed by MAID.
Without getting too sciencey, I want to get into the drugs that are actually used in a lethal injection. It's worth noting that there are no drugs that are made to actually kill people. There are drugs that can lead to death, but none that are manufactured for that purpose, correct?
I think that no drug company, is manufacturing a drug where the labeled indication is kill. Okay, it's not made for that. So no one makes that. So what is happening is that, both I think in the death penalty and in assisted dying, it's recognized that these drugs, these chemicals, can be repurposed and be converted into poison. But that's certainly not the intention. And it's, I think, pretty unambiguously not the practice of medicine. I think that what I really failed to appreciate when I started to write about this is how the Canadian, physician groups would take a very tepid stand on this. I thought that physicians would protest much more strongly than they have. And it's clear that there are physicians who are very much against this, but it seems that at the political level of the Canadian Medical Association and other organizations have been either taking no position or seem to be in favor. And that's, was shocking to me in a way, that Canadian physicians would not roundly protest this use of medicine now, to kill people.
I'd be interested to know, Dr. Zivit, what you think about the phrase dying with dignity.
That's a very good thing that you bring up, because I think that, what's happening here is a kind of representation of an action. And when people come, who want to die, and I recognize that people have that feeling, and they want to die, what they want to be, I think, is dead. And what they imagine that will happen is, once that they are dead, that will be the relief of their pain and suffering. Now, of course, we can't know that, because you have to survive to know that your suffering has been relieved. But I think that what there's been little focus on is the killing part of being dead. To get from alive to dead, you have to be killed, you have to die. And that's not instant, it's not instantaneous. So there's a thing that has to be done to you that causes your death. And that can take some time. And so words like dignity, of course, I mean, what does it mean to be dignified, to die with dignity? I think that I could easily suggest that someone who is, in great pain, someone who is disabled, who is struggling to be alive, in spite of the enormous pain that they may experience, well, I would find that very dignified. So to suggest somehow that the only dignity that is available to people who are suffering is to kill them feels to me to be a very, sinister use of the word dignity. Like you're basically saying that if you want to be alive, and in pain, there's something wrong with you. That dignity is only a positive thing. So if you're not dying with dignity, then you're living with undignity. And I push back. That's branding. That's a false and pernicious claim about people who want to be alive.
How concerned are you about this path that we're on, that as of March of 2027, MAID could possibly be available to those whose sole condition is mental illness?
That's obviously very disconcerting. I mean, let's hope between now and then that clear heads prevail. I don't know if that will happen or not. I mean, I take care of a lot of people who are mentally ill. That's a big part of my practice. And I have patients who arrive who've tried to kill themselves. They've taken an overdose or something like that. And when I encounter them, my assumption is that that they want to live, or at least that's my default. Like if a doctor doesn't, and sure enough, in many cases, once I have recovered them from their attempted suicide, they live more. They sometimes there's gratitude, sometimes there's not. But in terms of, as an operational plan, I think you want your doctor to assume that you want to live. And so when you're mentally ill, mental illness, leads to a series of bad decisions. So I don't know why, if we say that a person has mental illness and say loses capacity, that the capacity to request death, that thing is preserved. So why is a person who is mentally ill able to make that decision that they should be granted to be allowed to die? Like we certainly don't normally grant such a decision. When I have a patient again who's tried to commit suicide, they're involuntarily detained, for a period of time while I try to have them not die. So I don't know how we would know. I don't know how, like, it all comes down to, try to writing the rule that will protect people. So, if you want to have a situation like, is there some person, some particular theoretical person who has thought about it, who's done every possible thing, who is not under-resourced, who is not lonely, who is not, have all the other kinds of things that people may have, and they think that person, be allowed to die? I mean, okay, maybe, but I still don't think it's my job to do it. And the problem is that once you make that available, like you create opportunities for people, incentives for people to die. And that's the worst possible thing.
Just back to lethal injections for a moment. In light of what we know, it's basically death by drowning. I'm surprised more doctors aren't screaming from the rooftops.
I presented my concerns to the Senate of Canada. I don't know if you heard my testimony, and I was roundly criticized for it. And I was also, when we were testifying, a person who was there, waiting their turn to speak as well, who was an advocate of MAID, when talking about MAID, he began to cry and said it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. So when it came to my turn, and I suppose this is my own fault, I said to the chairperson, if you would like me to cry, I can do that too, if that will be effective. But and of course, after that, we were not getting along. But I thought that the theater of this And I'm not suggesting that this person was not sincere, but this kind of sense that the only beauty lies in killing people, like is a terrible, terrible idea. And this is what I feel like MAID seems to be saying.
So what would you like to see as the discussion around MAID moves forward? Who needs to maybe speak louder, and what needs to be heard, do you think?
Look, I think the other thing that MAID basically says is if you don't have us, then you're facing a terrible, painful death. And that's the first thing. That is untrue. So there is a whole branch of medicine, that I think has been probably underfunded, which is palliative care. And even without palliative care, like I'm again, a physician in intensive care, and I deal with people dying, and I'm pretty comfortable in providing people with sedation or pain control to allow a natural death. I don't need to kill them. They will die, and they don't have to die in pain. And even still, like I think that, what people really need, of course, is they need companionship. Like there's a really interesting study that looked, for example, at the labor epidurals. So if you look at, labor epidural use in the UK and in Canada, in the UK really, I think, had, and Canada, I think, is catching up with this system of a doula, who's someone who's there to help a woman who is laboring. And when you've got that kind of, encouragement and companionship that's effective understanding, it turns out that how much pain you experience is less. So it's not that we should ask people to go away and die, miserably on their own. Like we should be there in support of them while they live, as long as they can. And if it turns out that death is going to occur, then we should provide something to ease, the pain of natural dying. But we don't need to kill them to do that. It's just not true. So I think that MAID has created this kind of, this illusion that there's only two choices. It's either death, miserable, painful death, or MAID. And so that has to stop. That has to be challenged. I think that, the problem, of course, is that once you allow for MAID, then from a charter perspective, from a Canadian charter perspective, Section 7, it's true that anyone who wants it will be able to, I think, make a successful legal challenge and say, you can't deny me this right. Once it's instantiated in one group, it will be in every group. So it will be children. It will be the mentally ill. Like something has got to change. Or, the law has opened up this kind of floodgate through, I think, Section 7 challenges that will be, I think, upheld in by the court, because it will, any group can demand it. So this is a real problem. I mean, it's a real problem.
Dr. Zivit, I appreciate your time with us today. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Rod. I appreciate it.
Dr. Joel Zivit is a Canadian anesthesiologist practicing in the United States. And that wraps up our special report on medical assistance in dying. This discussion will no doubt be continuing and heating up as we approach 2027. Right now, those whose sole underlying condition is mental illness are excluded from accessing a medically assisted death, but that exclusion is scheduled to end in March of 2027. Thanks for joining us. Good night.